Chapter 4. Stansted to Oxford, Rain on Steel. She took a cab on her way to Oxford, as the car cut through the countryside like a scalpel, carving its way north from London into the spine of memory. Ava sat by the window, not seeing the fields, her reflection overlaying the glass, half ghost, half scholar. Her mind was in overdrive. Not with panic. Not yet. But with a slow, creeping pressure behind her eyes, like something ancient pressing through the cracks of consciousness. She hadn't slept since leaving Tehran. She had dreamt instead of bulls running under a bleeding sky, of 7-point stars and burning texts in languages she didn't speak but somehow knew. The symbols were getting clearer now. Familiar. Intimate. That was what frightened her most. The coin in her pocket was warm again. She pressed her palm against it through the fabric of her coat. That man in the cafe, he had said almost nothing. Just a few cryptic words before slipping it into her hand. It matched her sketches, her own work, years ago, from a notebook she'd left behind in Oxford. That's why she was here. The real work, her first, most dangerous thoughts, were still in Blair's office. The ones she never published. The ones he called obsessive, maybe brilliant. The one she left in a locked leather chest after the Viva, telling herself she'd return when the time was right. She never thought that time would be now, or that it would come with stars she couldn't name and dreams she couldn't wake from. She takes out the coin from her pocket. Nutters. Why do we have so many nutters in this field all of a sudden? Ava asked herself inwardly, as she tries to understand this displeasure and pleasure in her mind. She murmurs, "Hey, so this is how masochists feels." Her left side of her lip slides up, smiling despite her confusion. She arrives at the campus where she is having her postdoctoral fellowship. She wonders for how long she will be out in the field, since she still needs to mentor undergraduates. It was scheduled in a few months' time depending on the student's availability. Her trepidation is well-founded. The sources of information can come and go in her field. The truth can be so elusive since we do not have records from the past, although some were preserved, but they turn out so esoteric. She stares at the building after stepping off the car, and admires the trees outside the campus of Oxford, St. John's College, Professor Blair's archive. The campus was quiet. It always was in the late term, especially now. The sky over the quad was iron grey, and the familiar scent of old stone and wet leaves filled her lungs. It hadn't changed. But Ava had. She climbed the stairs to Blair's old office, now reassigned, the brass nameplate gone. But she had made arrangements. Dr. Karimi, a new Middle Eastern history fellow who'd admired her work, had helped arrange temporary access to the personal archives. Blair's effects were still being boxed. No one had touched the chest. Inside the office, Ava stood still for a moment. Books towered around her like silent sentinels. She opened the chest slowly. It was all there. Her old notes. Her original diagrams of the Tauroctony, drawn over with constellations. Her marginalia on Zoroastrian eschatology. A spread of sketched ritual circles, one of which now matched the pattern stamped on the coin. The validation she needed. The curse she didn't want. She sat down, spreading the papers across the desk like relics. She had the pieces. She could attack this like a scholar again, break it down. The dreams, the bull, the star, the knife, symbols from Mithraic liturgy, yes, but also distorted now. Something wanted her to remember. Be the coin, not Roman. Older. Almost Parthian, but with newer etchings added post-mint. Deliberate. See the unfinished notes, her own diagrams matched the coin exactly. There was no doubt now. She hadn't been hallucinating. She had been warned. 3 days earlier, Tehran International Airport. When she accepted the speaking invitation months ago, it had been about unfinished work. The Iranian Symposium on Comparative Mysticism and Indo-Iranian Esoterica was too perfect to decline. An unfinished chapter in her academic life, her dream thesis was to follow Mithraism backward to its roots. She thought this trip might help close that chapter. It didn't. It tore the book open. Especially when the event was cancelled. But before that, during her Tehran arrival, Imam Khomeini International Airport, 3:05 p.m. The glass doors hissed open as Ava wheeled her small suitcase into the arrival hall, blinking under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes stung from the long flight, and though she'd managed to sleep, the weight of transit still sat behind her ribs like damp cotton. She scanned the small crowd, then spotted her name in bold block letters. Dra. Nazari. The placard was held by a woman in her late 30s, tall and composed, wearing a navy blue manto and a loose scarf draped over her shoulders. Her smile was genuine, confident, and softened as their eyes met. "Dr. Nazari," she asked, stepping forward. "Yes, Ava. You must be my contact." "Indeed. Welcome to Tehran. I'm Shahad Amini. I'm here on behalf of the symposium organizers." Her accent was refined, Tehranite, her name unmistakably Persian. Shahad motioned subtly, and two men, both in collared shirts and jackets, one younger and broad-shouldered, the other wiry and watchful, stepped forward with polite nods. "These are my colleagues, Amir and Karosh. Don't worry, they're just here to make sure everything runs smoothly. You're in good hands." Ava smiled faintly. "Thank you. It's good to finally be here." They moved together toward the exit, Shahad guiding her like a practiced conductor. The Tehran sun washed the parking lot in gold as they crossed toward a dark green van, waiting with the engine quietly running. In the van, 3:20 p.m. The interior was cool. The faint scent of rosewater clung to the upholstery. Ava leaned back as the van merged onto the Imam Khomeini Expressway. "So," Shahad said, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "You flew in from London." "Stansted, actually. I left around 9 p.m. The hour drive to the airport exhausted me before I even boarded." Shahad laughed gently. "Typical England. Endless countryside before anything happens. I got a bit of sleep on the plane, thankfully. Not enough to dream, which is a relief these days." Shahad raised a brow but didn't ask further. Instead, she shifted gears easily. "I studied in Birmingham for a year. Rain taught me discipline." Ava chuckled. "And grey skies humility." Their rhythm grew more casual as the van cut northward into the city. Amir, seated in front, occasionally pointed out buildings or intersections with historical commentary, half guide, half local gossip. "To your right, see that domed structure? That used to be a cinema. The best popcorn in the city, they say. Now it's a prayer hall. And that tower," Karosh added, gesturing. "Milord. Built like a needle to stitch time together, some say. Tehran tries to touch the future but it forgets its past." Ava watched the city pass by in layers: glass, sand, tile, graffiti, prayer. Ancient signs leaned behind new ones. A boy selling saffron in traffic held a Quran in one hand and a smartphone in the other. "Is this your first time in Iran?" Shahad asked. "No, but the last time I was here, I was still a student. I didn't know what I was looking for then. I might now." Hotel Ferdowsi Grand, for 10 p.m. The van pulled up to the entrance of a stately beige building with mirrored windows and an ornate calligraphic plaque. A doorman in a crisp uniform opened Ava's door as Shahad exited on the other side. "I've arranged for your check-in," she said. "Your room has a view of the old city. Tomorrow was meant to be your talk, but we'll adjust. Dr. Sophie will meet you this evening, if you're not too tired." "I'm fine," Ava lied, gathering her satchel. I just need some tea. And maybe to look at my notes before they start rewriting themselves. Shah had gave her a look, somewhere between amusement and empathy. We all rewrite ourselves in this city, she said, offering a hand in parting. Welcome to Tehran, Dr. Nazari. Ava took it, firm. Thank you. Let's see what I remember, and what the city wants me to forget. Hotel Ferdowsi Grand, room 613, late afternoon. The hotel room was quiet, dimmed by beige curtains that filtered the Tehran sun into amber strips across the carpet. Ava dropped her satchel onto the upholstered chair and stood by the window for a long moment, unmoving, letting her body remember where it was. A subtle ache had begun to settle behind her eyes, the kind born of time travel without a machine. Jet lag, she knew, wasn't just biological, it was psychic. Her mind was still in England, pacing under the grey canopy of Cambridge skies, sorting through archives, memories, doubts. Now here she was, 6 hours ahead, in the ancient capital of a culture that had shaped her entire thesis, and could just as easily dismantle it. Room 613, oh, hey, why does it sound so Jewish, Ava murmurs as she overthinks, thinking of the song from 10,000 Maniacs, but ends up singing to Rainbow's End by Modern English. Why don't artists now write songs like that? She exhaled slowly and turned away from the window. Ava peeled off her coat, kicked off her shoes, and made herself a cup of weak hotel tea, bagged and bitter, but warm. She sat at the desk and opened her laptop. The screen lit her face with a cold light. Her desktop background still showed a photograph she'd taken in the British Museum, a Mithraic relief of the Tauroctony, the bull slaying. Mithra's eye skyward, dagger mid-thrust. She stared at it for a few seconds too long. She opened the folder titled Symposium, Probables. Within it were subfolders. Thesis core excerpts. Cultural translation notes. Symbolic frameworks, restricted. Contemporary context. Risk memo. She clicked through them methodically, despite the growing fatigue tugging at the back of her neck. Her fingers paused on the last one. Risk memo. It was a document she'd prepared just before her departure, part precaution, part confession. Note, while my thesis focuses on syncretic cultic symbolism between Roman Mithraism and Persian Zoroastrian tradition, care must be taken not to frame Mithra as a proto-Abrahamic figure in public forums. Avoid references to distortion of divine masculine archetypes in contemporary Islamic theology. Political authorities may misinterpret speculative elements, especially dream symbol correlations. She sighed. The moment her plane touched the tarmac, she knew she wasn't in a classroom anymore. And this wasn't just an academic discussion. Her thesis had already stirred waves back home, revisiting the solar covenant. Mithraic persistence in modern religious identity was bold, yes, but it had also been branded irresponsible by a few conservative reviewers. Ava had argued that Mithra wasn't just an obscure deity reabsorbed by Rome. She argued, carefully, footnotedly, that he was remembered differently in the East. That, under different skies, he survived in symbols, in Sufi poetry, in the etymology of prayer itself. But how would that land here, today, in the middle of Tehran? She glanced at the printed itinerary left on her desk. Her slot had been scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow, in the Sufi panel on divine allegory and symbolic continuity. She took a notebook from her satchel, leather-bound, the corners worn from use. Her handwriting filled it in loops and slants, half in English, half in shorthand symbols only she could decipher. She flipped to a blank page and began jotting down new titles. Sun in the Cave, Ancient Light and Modern Shadows. The Eye in the Bull, Symbolic Lineage and Visionary Phenomena. Speaking the Silent Name, a Mystical Repetition Across Eras. She crossed them all out. Too esoteric. Too provocative. Too close to the dreams. Instead, she wrote, Mithra in Memory, continuities in symbol and silence. Neutral. Academic. Open-ended. Ava leaned back. The tea had gone cold. The weight of the flight returned to her limbs, but her mind was catching fire again. Faces, dreams, coins. Everything pointed back to symbols she had once sketched out in libraries and dismissed. Now, they burned. She stood, stretching her arms overhead. The evening call to prayer rose faintly from the streets beyond the window, its melody softer than she remembered. Not a call to obedience. A reminder of rhythm. Jet lag was disorientation of rhythm. And yet, she was here. Right on time. Hotel Ferdowsi Grand, Breakfast Lounge, second morning in Tehran, 9:10 a.m. The hotel lounge buzzed with hushed voices and silver cutlery over white linen. The television near the bar murmured local news, Arabic script scrolling beneath images of a cordoned-off hillside, blurry night vision footage, and a brief clip of a woman fainting during an interview. Ava stirred her coffee slowly. Her appetite had fled sometime in the night, but she still brought a half-eaten slice of sangak to her lips as a gesture of grounding herself. A tall figure entered from the lobby, flanked by Shahad in a pale green manto. Dr. Nazari, Shahad greeted warmly, stepping closer. This is Dr. Hossein Sofi, Chair of Comparative Mysticism at Tehran University. Ava stood and extended her hand. Dr. Sofi was older than she expected, mid-60s perhaps, with a neatly trimmed beard and thin glasses that slid slightly down the bridge of his nose. He wore a dark suit, no tie, and a weathered briefcase hung from one hand. His eyes were sharp, observant, too much so. Dr. Nazari, he said, clasping her hand in both of his. A pleasure long overdue. We followed your work from afar with great interest. Thank you, Ava replied. Though I confess I expected a more formal setting for our meeting. Sophie gave a tight, unreadable smile. Yes, well. I must apologize. The symposium as planned, today, at least, has been postponed. Possibly even cancelled. Shahad's expression tightened slightly. Ava blinked. Cancelled? Is this about the event last night? Dr. Sophie sighed and motioned for her to sit. He joined her at the table, lowering his voice. The official report names it as a gas explosion in a storage facility near A. Some say it was an act of sabotage. Others are not so certain. He paused just long enough to suggest that he wasn't. I was on the phone until dawn with some of our university's contacts. A few colleagues who were there when it happened. They described it as, he hesitated, searching for a neutral word, unusual. There were lights. Noises. Vibrations in the ground that made no seismic sense. Some spoke of visions. Others fled in panic. One man, a cleric, began reciting old Avestan verses without realizing it. Ava narrowed her gaze. But it's being called an accident. Officially, he nodded. Iran has a long history of managing anomalies. A silence fell between them for a moment. His face held a studied calm, but Ava noticed the subtle twitch of his jaw muscle. Micro-expressions, fear, perhaps, or suppressed awe. He leaned in just slightly. But I am not here to sound like a lunatic. Ava gave a wry smile. You'd be surprised how often that line gets crossed in my circles. Dr. Sophie's mouth twitched into a smile of relief. He sat back. In light of the situation, we've decided to hold a private roundtable instead. Today. More of an informal gathering of scholars at the university's conference room. We'll discuss our findings in a less scrutinized environment. I see, Ava said, finishing her coffee. And you still want me to present? Especially now, he said. Your work may offer a context we badly need. Perhaps more than we realized. Shahad, who had remained standing, interjected. We'll leave in half an hour, if that works for you. The university is only a short drive. Ava nodded slowly. Yes. Let me grab my notes. She stood, suddenly aware of how much her limbs still ached from travel and sleep interrupted by dreams. She turned back to Dr. Sophie before heading to the elevator. Doctor, she said. If I may ask, these witnesses. The ones who spoke of visions. Did any of them mention the bull? His eyes flickered for half a second. He did not smile this time. We can speak more on that when we're safely behind closed doors. Scene, Tehran University, conference room, late morning. The conference room was tucked behind an arched corridor in the older wing of Tehran University, cool, dim, with faded Persian carpets lining the floor beneath a long walnut table. It smelled of books, ink, and a trace of something older, copper, perhaps, or dust from an archive that hadn't been opened in years. There were only 8 people present, all seated in a loose circle. Most were men in various states of scholarly dishevelment, dressed plainly but with the unmistakable weight of academic gravitas. 2 women sat apart, one in a chador, another in a sharp linen suit. Dr. Sophie stood at the head, a printed copy of Ava's thesis beside his elbow. Ava clutched her notes but hadn't opened them. Her instincts told her to listen first. Dr. Sophie cleared his throat. We are not gathered here to panic, he said, his tone calm but firm. We are gathered because the event last night, however it is named by the authorities, triggered phenomena that intersect uncomfortably with our fields of study. A soft chuckle rose from one man in glasses. You make us sound like occultists. Dr. Sophie didn't smile. Perhaps we are. He gestured toward Ava. Dr. Nazari, your thesis raised serious controversy in the UK academic circuit, suggesting continuity between Mithraic rites and present-day mystical expressions in both East and West. Would you say, in light of what happened last night, that your symbols have re-emerged not in metaphor, but in manifestation? Ava blinked. She wasn't expecting to be addressed so directly. She started, flipping open her notebook. I'm not prepared to say that. Yet. My work is comparative in nature, not predictive. But I will say that what you've described, visions, celestial light, spontaneous utterances, match elements I've studied in multiple mytho-religious movements. Especially in Zoroastrian apocalyptic cycles. Even some Roman imperial cult experiences. Could it be mass hysteria? Someone asked. Maybe, Ava said. But the specificity of the symbols, bulls, fire, even invocations, suggests something else. Something triggered. Dr. Sophie nodded. One witness reported seeing a horned shadow behind a star. Another said she heard a voice call out her name, but in a tongue she didn't know. These are not things one invents under pressure. An older gentleman across the table, with a voice like dry leaves, spoke up. The site of the event in Ray, beneath it are ruins. Old ones. Pre-Islamic. Fire temples, some say. Others whisper about older Mithraeums repurposed by the early Muslims and buried to silence a legacy that would not die. Have those ruins been excavated? Ava asked. No, the man replied. Because they are not supposed to exist. A silence fell. Someone mentioned Yazd, another mentioned an abandoned Zoroastrian dakma, Tower of Silence, now used as a military storage area. Patterns were forming, but they resisted conclusion. Ava scribbled fragments in her notebook. Bull plus star equals Tauraktani variant? Spontaneous chant equals ancient liturgy? Shadow equals divine being or symbol. Ray equals original fire altar? Then came a quiet comment from the woman in the chador, her voice soft but sharp. We must be careful. If Mithra rises, he rises in judgment, not affection. That sentence lingered longer than anything else. Scene transition, late afternoon, Café Golestan. Ava sat by the window of the quiet cafe across the street from the university. She hadn't spoken for the last 30 minutes. A single cup of thick Persian coffee sat before her, cooling. Her notebook was open, pages smeared with hurried ink, arrows, question marks, and fragments of ancient languages she hadn't reviewed in years. She looked out at the street. She had come to Iran expecting to speak, to clarify, to be the authority on her subject. But now, all she had were more questions. What had happened in Ray wasn't just inexplicable, it was targeted, echoing her own research, her own dreams. The coin. The symbols. The name Mithra whispering itself beneath the surface of language and light. She thought of what Dr. Sophie had said. Would you say your symbols have re-emerged, not in metaphor, but in manifestation? She hadn't answered properly then. She wasn't ready. Now, watching a pair of dervishes walk past the cafe window, robes catching the golden light, Ava felt the pull again. Something was rising. And it wasn't waiting for her to be ready. Scene, Café Golestan, late afternoon. The hum of quiet conversation and the occasional hiss of an espresso machine filled the air. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting dusty golden patterns on Ava's notes. She didn't notice him at first. The man had entered quietly, almost imperceptibly. He wore a tailored coat, dark but worn at the cuffs, and his face was partially hidden by a simple flat cap. Late 30s perhaps, or older. He ordered nothing. Just approached her table with the air of someone who had waited long enough. "Excuse me," he said, his Farsi-tinted English clipped but elegant. "May I?" Ava glanced up, startled at first. Then confused. There was something vaguely familiar about him. She hesitated. "Do I know you?" "Not yet." He smiled faintly. "But I've read your work." He gestured to the seat opposite her. She nodded, cautiously. "Dr. Ava Nazari," he said, sitting down. "Your thesis on syncretic eschatology made more waves than you realize." "That's generous," she replied, closing her notebook halfway. "Some called it heretical." "Yes," he said. "They would." A pause. She tried to place him academic? Diplomatic circle? He didn't speak like a local, not entirely. His accent wavered between Iranian and something more European. "You said you've read my work," Ava said slowly. "May I ask your name?" He ignored the question. Instead, he reached into his coat and placed something between them, a small, tarnished coin. Bronze. Worn edges. But the image was unmistakable, a bull beneath a man in a Phrygian cap, dagger raised, surrounded by a ring of indistinct figures, stars, maybe. Or flames. Ava froze. Her pulse quickened. She knew this design. Had drawn it herself during her early doctoral research. But the coin had never been catalogued. It had come from a half-burnt vellum sketch in the margins of an Armenian codex. She had dismissed it as symbolic. She stared at the object, then back at him. "Where did you get this?" He shrugged slightly. "It's been passed down." Carefully. "From where?" "Somewhere older than memory," he replied. She didn't look away. "This iconography, it's not Roman. This version predates their version of the cult." "It has?" "Avestan traces. You shouldn't have this." His eyes flicked to hers. "Neither should you have seen it in your dreams." The breath caught in her throat. "I never published that," she said quietly. "I know." The silence that followed seemed to warp the air around them. The clatter of the cafe faded into a distant hum. "I don't understand," she said. "What is this?" He stood. Ava reached for the coin, but he covered it with his hand. "Not yet," he said. "But you will." Then he took her hand gently, turned it palm up, and placed the coin into it. As her fingers closed around the cold metal, he leaned slightly closer. "When the bull rises," he whispered, "follow the stars. Not the priests." And just like that, he walked away. By the time she stood up, trying to catch him, he had already vanished into the afternoon crowd, as if swallowed by the city itself. Ava sat down again, staring at the coin in her palm. Whatever this was, it wasn't research anymore. It was a summons. Scene: Ava's hotel room, evening, Tehran. The call to prayer echoed faintly in the distance, slipping through the narrow window slats like incense on a breeze. Ava sat curled on the edge of the low divan by the desk, her notebook open, the coin resting in the center of its spine like a seal she didn't dare disturb. Her mind was a storm of symbols and instincts. She had spent the last hour pacing, scrawling erratic notes, cross-referencing old sketches she hadn't looked at in years, some of which mirrored the engraving on the coin exactly. There was no chance of coincidence. And yet, she couldn't go further. Not here. Not now. Not with the Iranian authorities circling the strange event in Ray, already framing it as a possible act of terrorism. Eyewitnesses reported lights, voices, even celestial visions, but the official line would undoubtedly stamp it out with something colder, bureaucratic. Something that always made things disappear. She knew how these things worked. And Ava Nazari, British scholar or not, was still of Iranian descent. The thought struck her like a slap. In her passport, she was English. Her accent was Oxford. But her blood? Her cheekbones? Her father's quiet mutterings in Farsi when he thought she wasn't listening. They told another story. One that might not matter in Britain, but here, it could become dangerous. Especially if anyone found out what she had come looking for. Especially if someone knew she had been dreaming about Mithra before the light over Ray split the sky. She ran a hand through her hair and stood abruptly, walking to the mirror. The woman who stared back looked drawn, older than the last time she had been on this soil. And her eyes weren't just tired. They were haunted. Searching. She had to think. Strategize. Withdraw, if necessary. "If I go near the site in Ray," she whispered to her reflection, "I'll be flagged. If I request access to the archives now, it'll look suspicious. Even if I use Dr. Sophie's name." A pause. And if they find out who I really am? The thought trailed off. The woman in the mirror didn't finish it either. Ava walked back to the desk and shut her notebook, sliding the coin into a linen pouch and tucking it into the lining of her coat. The implications were too large, the connections too wild, and yet, they were drawing a line directly through her life. She needed distance. Clarity. "I'll go back to England," she said to herself. "Just for a few days. Regroup. Go through the rest of my notes. The originals in Oxford." She paused again, considering it all. There was a risk, of course, of missing something crucial here on the ground. But a greater risk loomed in acting recklessly. Especially now. She glanced toward the window, to the city below, vibrating with the tension of too many layers hidden beneath too many names. "There's something happening," she murmured. "And it's not just historical. It's active. It's alive." But to understand it fully, she had to be prepared. She would need allies. More than just translations and theories, she needed access, protection, insight. A network. Her thoughts turned to someone she hadn't spoken to in years. An old mentor. A contact in Istanbul. A former classmate in Rome. People who had seen more than they let on. But first, home. Back to England. Back to the archives. Back to where it all began. She turned off the lamp, letting the last light of the city wash over her room like a closing veil. Below, Tehran murmured on, unaware, or perhaps not unaware at all, that one of its daughters had returned bearing a forgotten flame. Tomorrow, she would book the flight. Tonight, she would sleep. If sleep would take her. Present day, on her arrival in UK. Of course you don't just get into the symposium or event. She needed to acclimatize to the time zone and the jet lag. She blames herself for not coming earlier. The night before the symposium, something strange had happened in Iran's southeastern provinces. A blast of light, seen from the sky. No casualties. No infrastructure damage. But the government had locked down travel in the region. No one knew what it was. Some whispered of supernatural events. The authorities, true to form, declared it a likely foreign provocation or terrorist incident. They were good at that, so it was natural for them. You can say it takes one to know one. Still, the hosts told her to come. Not for the symposium, but for a private circle of scholars. More intimate. More urgent. She almost didn't go. But something gnawed at her. This wasn't just scholarship anymore. The coin, the dreams, the chest of diagrams, something was being orchestrated. Or awakened. She could have brought the notes with her the first time, she thought bitterly, looking at the heavy leather satchel beside her. But at the time it had seemed impractical, traveling through airports with a mini-archive. And foolish. Who would need decades-old notes about a dead god? She exhaled. Fool, she whispered to herself. Funding and fellowship, the real reason she was on the plane. She wasn't traveling on a tourist visa. The UK government had vouched for her. She was not even British, but a dual citizen just to get some benefits. Her postdoctoral fellowship had been supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but it was a private patron that made the trip possible, a foundation allegedly interested in the cultural transmission of ancient rituals. Ava didn't know the patron. She had never met him. He seemed to be one of those men who wanted his name on plaques more than he wanted to understand the ideas he funded. It didn't matter. What mattered was the door he opened. The funding had allowed her access to archives, artifacts, and now, Iran. She learned recently, too late, that it was Blair who had nominated her originally. He had believed in her. Saw something in her work even though she didn't. Her last publication before Tehran, The Solar Sacrament, Traces of Mithra in Pre-Nicene Iconography, had stirred controversy. Reviewers either called it audaciously revisionist or dangerous apologetics. She didn't care. It was honest. And now, the truth was unraveling faster than she could control.